When I was younger and still living at home, Christmas time was often a time of great temptation for me. Because my mother spent most of her time leading up to Christmas with late nights and little sleep because she loved to bake things for family and friends. And as you can imagine, there are few things more tempting to a young boy than fresh and hot cookies sitting on the counter. So needless to say, there may have been many times in which I snuck some cookies from the fruit of my mother's labor, despite the fact that she had been up half the night baking them. And I don't know if any of y'all have had similar experiences to this in your own childhood, but it does show one very important truth. Temptation is a part of all of our lives. And today's gospel shows that even Jesus was tempted during his earthly life. For in today's gospel, we read, the Spirit drove Jesus out into the desert, and he remained in the desert for 40 days, tempted by Jesus. And even though from the Gospel of Mark, we don't get much of an insight into what that temptation looked like, if we look into the two other synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke, we get the fuller story. Because in Matthew chapter 4, we read, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was hungry. And Luke, in the same chapter 4, states, he ate nothing during those days, and when they were over, he was hungry. So from these two, we can see that he fasted for 40 days, and it wasn't just the kind of fasting that you and I typically do, where we may give up a meal occasionally, or we give up sweets or something like that. It literally said he ate nothing, no food for 40 days. And if this seems crazy, notice it doesn't say he didn't drink anything, which means he still partook of water. And if it still sounds crazy, I did a little personal research, and there have actually been documented accounts of people for fasting from food for up to 40 days, according to a scientific journal. So I would hope that that has some good research that went into it. So keeping that in mind, it is humanly possible that Jesus could have done this. However, I don't think any of us can imagine how strong the hunger must have been when Satan came and tempted him with food. Because I have missed breakfast and lunch before, but I still got to eat dinner that evening. And I still remember before dinner, I was quite hungry. And my stomach was speaking to me in another language, should we say, because of that hunger. So imagine, as hard as it may be when we miss one meal, just the hunger pains that Jesus felt as he was offered by Satan bread. Yet he realizes by doing so, by taking of that bread offered to him through Satan, he would be forsaking his love for the Father. And he rejects even though his body may desire it. Because one of the great challenges of temptation is that the more we desire it, the harder it is to say no to it. And add on top of that, if the actual thing that you desire is right in front of you. And that is exactly what happened to Jesus. And in a similar but much less severe way, that is what happened to me as a child. The whole day the kitchen would smell of baking, and it would raise my desire. And once the cookies were sitting on the counter unattended, the temptation would begin to increase. And as I said, temptation is a part of our lives, and it is virtually impossible to completely escape from temptation. And like with the cookies, the easier it is to acquire, the more likely we are to fall deeper into temptation, and the harder it is to say no. For if someone struggles with gossip, if they spend their time around people who also gossip, there's a great temptation. Or if someone is a newly recovering alcoholic and still goes to parties where alcohol is freely served, there is a great temptation. But one thing that I have yet to mention is something the Archbishop spoke about in his letter before Mass. His desire to protect his flock, which is every one of us here, from some of the temptations that the internet offers. So much so that he has declared that the first Sunday of Lent this year would be called Safe Haven Sunday, meaning that he is strongly encouraging families to make their homes safe from internet temptations for their whole family. In other words, making the home a safe haven by preventing access to some of the evil areas of the internet. For as I said earlier, the easier it is to receive what it is that we desire, the greater the temptation. And on the reverse side, the harder it is to receive what we desire, the less the temptation. For if my mother had put the cookies out of reach for a young child instead of on the counter, it would have been much harder for me to get to them, and thus the temptation would be less. Thus, my brothers and sisters, the more we learn about the things that may be temptations for you and I, and for our families, the more that we can do to both protect ourselves and our families. So the challenge for each and every one of us is to make this Lent fruitful by striving to limit the temptations of our lives, by reducing our access to those temptations, and thus free all of our hearts to be directed towards those things we both need and desire: the love of our Lord and the love of our family and friends.